So let me just quickly with the West. The question of efficacy is in the air. Like, so, you know, it is hard. But you told us a story off mic, so I thought I just wanted to share it with others. Something happened to you which made you curious and you wanted to fix it. What was it?
I'm not sure you know what.
This was this was an eyesight problem, I think, right? Or what was it?
Age-related macular degeneration.
Yeah. Yeah. Why did you mention age-related macular degeneration just now?
Well, I think it came up when we did the 23andMe testing to start with. One of the things that we found that we had no reason to suspect ahead of time was that we had actually both my wife and I, but actually not our children, had an increased likelihood of having, I think it was actually exfoliation glaucoma. And we'd never heard of this. I never knew what exfoliation glaucoma was to start with, but you can have small precipitates that form in your eyes, and eventually it can block your eyesight. So we went off and having learned that this was the case, said, well, we should have a doctor take a look at this. So we went to see an ophthalmologist. Both my wife and I scheduled visits and had them look to say, well, are there any precipitates forming? Is there anything we should know about this? And he was surprised that we were coming in with this genetic information, but said, sure, I'll take a look. And the conclusion was he looked and couldn't see anything, but come back in 5 years. So we have the ability now to know that there's something to look for. The test is easy and relatively inexpensive, and it gives us a way to look ahead of time. And it's my understanding that this is a disease which is related to the pressure inside your eyes, and that and they also measured the pressure and said actually yours is normal. But they can monitor that over the years, and if it starts to go up, which might tend to lead towards the disease, then there are medicines that can help bring that pressure back down and might mitigate that. So this was, to me, a perfect example of why you do this kind of testing and why we've gone further with genome sequencing, because we're not doing it necessarily to find out about a disease that we already know about it. We're looking for new news from the data to say you should look out for thus and such, and it's our sense that not everything by any means is actionable, but that many things may be, and that it's worth exploring. And this was an example in a simple way of us learning something where we were able to go take medical action, and we think we'll be better off because of it.
Can you imagine like the doctor's office in 2050 where the door it's a revolving, how about, what about, I've read, oh my God, here it is, and it would be just like the same thing. It would be like the Doctors' Employment Act of 2010 that becomes like an incredibly, we could be generating a lot of silly business here, or we could be generating a lot of very smart business, because this would all be very, very, very valuable to not pay the bills for macular degeneration if you don't have to.
Right. The cost of having many of these diseases is dramatically higher than the cost of preventing them if you can. So I think this is something that can lower the cost of healthcare, and from our standpoint, it is also something that perhaps can improve healthcare and improve health. So we're optimistic about following that path.
So since we've been sort of down on this whole thing the whole day long, I was wondering, and you're into business, what is wrong with Carl and my analysis? Like, we just think, it's not speaking, I mean, we're giving everybody the impression
I think you're a little more dour than I am, right?
Yeah, okay. That this is a slog. It is a slog through public acceptance, through privacy issues, and yet you seem to think you can make money doing this and make good money, I'm assuming.
And we do already.
And you do already.
Yeah. You know, look, I think fundamentally that the ability to understand our genome has to be one of the underpinnings of finally or ultimately figuring out how life works. And that clearly has human implications, but I would say it also has enormous societal implications around energy use, for example. Plant biology, biofuels, there are many other applications for this technology beyond what we've even talked about today. And it's just a profoundly important foundational set of technologies that will, I think, change the world.
And you, sir, oh, go ahead.
But isn't it, okay, so for example, my wife and I were at the doctor's office the other day, and I was staring beyond the counter at the medical records in the back. Row after row of paper folders. Majority of medical offices still keep their records in paper. Is it possible, and maybe George you can address this too, is it possible to drop this almost sort of magical supply of information into that kind of environment and have it really help. You know, I mean, doesn't my doctor have to stop first and get rid of all those paper folders and get everything on an iPad first? You know, how is all of this going to help in the environment that we're in right now?
Well, in a way, they are in the process of converting to electronic medical
Very slowly,
records
though.
and personally controlled health records, which is independent of those happening in the outside world. DNA has the advantage that it has no legacy like that, and so it actually can be implemented right away without necessarily reading in all those old records. I think they're completely separable issues.
Well, I would agree. I think they are separable issues. There are a whole host of reasons why doctors haven't digitized healthcare, and separate subject. But I do believe that this can happen in a parallel path. Now, having said that, there are a whole host of changes that have to happen in how doctors are trained, how doctors ultimately practice genetic medicine, and I think it's a very exciting field in terms of the change effort to be involved. But it's coming to a theater near you because it is moving incredibly fast. Yeah.
My last question goes to you, and I guess it's the big one, which is that you have always had this abiding faith that at some point the benefits of this kind of work will become so obvious to so many people that it will be kind of almost a mistake not to do it. That the normal thing to do would be get yourself checked and have that information, and you can opt out, but opting out would almost be like a public health kind of, it would be antisocial. But in order to get to that place, there will have to be a moment somewhere in between now and then where some application or some discovery makes it kind of imperative. The obvious one would be you could cure things, but that's becoming a little elusive. The second obvious one is that it would help you eat and sleep and exercise and do things right, and that would become very obvious. Or the other one is it's got great TV programming and you can find out about your grandpa. Or Glenn Close has somehow endorsed it, and it's fabulous. What do you think is going to make the difference? Since you insist that there will be a difference one day, but how will you get there?
Just to clarify, you can read my mind that I think there's a difference, but scientifically we're testing the hypothesis that there might make a difference. Okay, maybe that's too fussy. I think that it's already happened, and it's something we just don't notice. Medical genetics has almost 1,800 genes, which are medically actionable. That doesn't mean entertaining. It actually means that there is something you can do to prevent it or deal with it. It can be a difference in diet. It could be something that actually would be good advice for everybody, but nobody's going to act on it until they know they have a predisposition. So that's actually quite a bit. That's, and that's 10% of the population has these rare diseases. I think that's going to penetrate even more broadly, and we're not going to say there's a moment where we have a killer application. Clearly, people like Glenn Close are going to help get people educated about this. And I think the real big, if there were to be a tipping point, it would be differentiating between this business model and, say, the cell phone model. Cell phone is you get something, you play with it all day. And I'm not going to get my genome and play with it all day necessarily. Some people will. It's more like an insurance policy, which is I've got accident insurance, dismemberment, fire, and so forth. And I genuinely hope that I never collect on those, right? I don't want to be dismembered, and so I want, but everybody has insurance, even though they think that they're at low risk. The fact is, everybody in this room and everybody in the world is at risk for basically every single genetic disease until you get that readout, and then maybe you've got something that tells you you're going to make it to the age of Skip's dad or more. Okay.
So there are 1,000 paths, you think, to giving people just a hint that this is something you could, because there is obviously a burden attached. I mean, you worry about it, you worry about your kids, you worry about privacy and all that. And there's an obvious advantage, is that you could maybe not get sick, or you could maybe postpone your getting sick late enough that it doesn't matter.
Right.
And that's the question. It's like, will enough people get the second sense?
I think the kind of community that we're building here and the kind of conversation we're having here is going to raise consciousness, and there'll be many other meetings like this, hopefully, and other forms, other ways that it gets into the media. And there's so much you can do now. We don't have to keep saying, well, 10 years from now, 20 years from now. It's 2 years ago, really, is what people need to start talking about.
But Joe, I just want to ask, what about the flip side? And you alluded to this at the beginning. We've been talking about genetic variation as this terrible thing because it makes us sick in all sorts of interesting ways. What about the flip side, which might be, lo and behold, you might have a gene associated with perfect pitch or with a certain kind of athletic performance and so on. Do you think that is going to start to come into the discussion more? Are people going to be wanting to know that? Or is that overshadowed by our anxiety about death?
They definitely want to know about it. I just from talking with not just the Personal Genome Project, but in lots of other discussions, people are fascinated with behavioral cognitive tests, and that's part of the Personal Genome Project. Parents will do just about anything to get their kid another 20 points on their SAT. I mean, not all parents, but some. And this is one way that if there's something they can do to change the diet or the lifestyle or whatever they can do, I think that's almost inevitable. Perfect pitch
but
or athletic ability would you might just be a tendency to try something that you wouldn't necessarily have tried. I might have lived in a family that would have not done any piano lessons or send me out in sweat clothes because they just didn't have time for it. But if they saw that I had some possible advantage at that, they might try it. And maybe I don't have a possible advantage, but it's still good they tried it, right?
Did you find out that you have a special trait? I mean, a good one?
I haven't been quite as introspective as I should have been. I'm sorry. Yeah, we'll get to it. Yeah.
Do you have a narcoleptic problem sometimes? Do you just fall asleep suddenly, as I recall? Yeah. No, not that.
Yeah.
But don't you also you have a pretty good memory too? So maybe there's some kind of.
I think you were saying so. Yeah. But,
well,
we definitely have.
It's the Barney thing. Like, there's nobody in the world just exactly like you. You're special and you're marvelous, kind of thing. I will, just to completely conclude, the thing about George's marvelosity is that when he was deciding to do this, and then his people, they called up and they said, like, you want to do it? And I said, I only will do it with Carl. And then I said, I'm not crazy about this whole thing, and it makes me nervous, and I'm not an optimist, and I just worry a lot. And this is going to be one of these celebratory days, and I'm just going to be nervous in front of all of your celebrators. Like, what kind of a party would that be? And to my amazement, they said, okay. So I think we're both kind of grateful to have been party to this. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for inviting us.
We're very grateful to you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
So there's actually a few minutes. We have a few minutes for Q&A. If you want to take just a couple questions from the audience.
Oh, okay.
If you don't mind, just a few minutes there, and then I'm going to make a few announcements about lunch and some activities in the afternoon at the end of the Q&A. Thanks.
Well, yes.
Okay.
Hi, I'm.
Yeah, I think you got a mic. Is it turn on?
Thank you. Okay, so I got the mic. I'm Yan Gao, and I'm also George's former postdoc. Now I'm an assistant professor at Virginia Commonwealth University. I'm in the sequencing business. My lab used one of the early Illumina machines, and we are quite successful. So I think in order to get the general public to get interested and enthusiastic about getting the genomic information out, the clinical data out, maybe one of the things we can do is we cannot hope for a cure for disease by knowing the sequence alone. But if the FDA has, say, started the practice to say every drug now comes with a set of markers from 23andMe or from other company to say this drug is only suitable for this kind of SNP. If you have this, if you have a certain SNPs, you cannot take the drug because you will have a severe side effect. I think then the general public, when they talk to a doctor, they will know actually the genetic information. It's an advantage to get your genetic information to the doctor, because it will help you to prevent side effect.
But there are a number of things you just said, like that everybody who goes in and has their blood sample, the blood will go to some computer cloud somewhere where it will then be available to hospitals and doctors. And are we ready for a situation in which when you give blood that the information then goes to a computer in a cloud somewhere that people can, I mean, do you even believe that it will remain anonymous up there in the computer cloud?
Well, I mean, this gets back to the whole privacy matter around healthcare information, and there are regulations around that already. And so between what's in HIPAA and now in GINA, I believe that we have a fairly robust set of regulations that have to be enforced, have to be followed.
So you heard this is a description of give your blood, and here in Kansas City, all the babies have their blood taken, and that blood will go around and will help us all together, and we will be able to make matches, and we will be able to compare individuals and eventually help you eat right or get better. That somehow out of this sampling, giant sampling, will come a faster paced set of cures. George? That's, I guess, the question.
Well, I think that's going to be great. I think some of the barriers that will exist may favor the public projects over highly private ones, but eventually we'll probably be able to do it both ways. And yeah, the more sharing that occurs, the better it's going to be. And some of the data will get compromised. That's.
And you'll have the SUPI problems, like how dare you take my blood and use it for this or that purpose, even though I consented. I didn't understand that I consented and that sort of thing.
Well, that's why we make them take an exam that Skip was so proud he got 100% on.
Yeah.
There's one back there.
Hi, I'm Christina Barron. I'm from Kennedy Academy for Health Careers. And I have a question. What mechanisms are you guys putting in place to assure people that the genetic sequence is harmless and actually beneficial? And how are you going to possibly educate the public? Because my family and my mother, she's not really, familiar with the way that technology is running now. Would be kind of afraid to try to do the genome sequencing. So, what way would I be able to let her know that it's okay for her to do that?
I don't think it's something we should rush into. I mean, the education will take some time to percolate out. High schools are a really great place to start with that, but at every level we need to have that discussion. The early adopters will be taking some of the body blows. There's no doubt about it. They're getting some of the advantages, but they're also getting some of the disadvantages, and you can study in the newspapers and in all the media what's happening to the early adopters. But I think if you or your family has any doubts, you should wait.
I'm curious whether Anne would have, if your father had been opposed to this and you had been interested in doing it, or your father just been scared of it, wouldn't that change the dynamic completely?
Well, he was a lot of the influence that got me interested in this in the first place. However, if I had still been interested in it, then I probably still would have, at some point, at least had genotyping from 23andMe or being sequenced at some later date.
But it would have been your $99.
Yes, probably, but it's $99, so it's not terribly expensive for a series of genetic tests that medically could save me a lot more money later. So actually, it's an investment that pays off for a lot of people who do it.
I'm wondering in the back there, is the argument called if your mom is worried about it but you want it, do you think you could prevail if you had the $99? I don't know where.
I'd have to be over 18.
Yeah.
At least.
Are you over 18 back there? I can't see you.
I am 18.
You're 18. Okay.
99 was only for DNA day.
That's right. Yeah.
Maybe they'll do it again.
I think we. Any question over here?
So, fantastic discussion. A number of you alluded, and a number of the discussants alluded to this, but maybe we can elaborate a little bit on training of most healthcare professionals to understand DNA, to understand genetics, to understand how to steer patients. What do you think is being done to help the medical profession catch up to where the technology is?
Maybe I can take that. We're very concerned about that for obvious reasons that we've talked about here today. And in fact, what we've more recently done is sponsor two, I think, leading folks in this industry. One, Dr. Eric Topol, and we've given him a very large grant to develop a certification program for doctors to ultimately go through. And then another gentleman who's really doing, I think, pioneering medicine of people who are near the end of life, have really exhausted all other medical possibilities to get sequenced and figure out perhaps a therapy that could save their life. We've given him money for fellowships to be alongside of him and understand how he's practicing medicine using sequencing today for people who are really at the end. And we'll do more because I think we have to stimulate this whole change of training of medical practitioners.
I'd like to express a different opinion on this. I actually, although I think it's great for doctors to have more education on this, I think it's inconceivable that the body of doctors that exist in the country will all become such experts on every single possible genetic disease that they can possibly handle it. In our genomes alone, there are probably changes in amino acids in 10,000 genes. You know, the chance that any doctor can become an expert on those 10,000 genes and every possible mutation, I think, is zero. I think what's really needed here, and I think a number of the companies, whether it's Genome or whether it's Omics or some of the others, is there needs to be a technology that automates this interpretation, provides prioritization of this, that you take the knowledge and you somehow automate that, because if you have to go one gene at a time and find one expert on that gene for every single one, and if each person who's sequenced has to go through that, it's intractable. The cost of the sequencing, the data is going to be flooding in, and there will be this intractable problem of how do you handle it. And I don't think that saying let's educate all the doctors in America on all these different genetic diseases is a way to handle it. I think they need to be trained on, once there is the software which can do the analysis and come up with some prioritization, to then understand where to take their patients. But it's not going to be the doctors sitting down and saying, well, let me read the haplotype map and figure out this mutation and that on each one of the 10,000 genes. I think there's not a chance that that's going to get there. So it's really more
I think it'll be
a
the
question of how you
rise
get
of a subspecialty like you saw in radiology.
Let's take a question on the front row now.
Yes, my name is Steve Coles from the School of Medicine at UCLA, and I wanted to have some better perspective on the third leg of the stool that's sort of missing from our discussion. You know, we know that individual genes determine your hair color before it gets to be gray, and that maybe your IQ is a polygenic trait and so forth, and that your environment influences the expression of your genome. But those are only two legs. And when I did research with Roy Walford looking at the phenotype of longevity of mice about 20 years ago, we controlled the genome. They were all congenic mice. We controlled the environment perfectly. You know, they all had the same food, the same lighting conditions, everything was the same, but they never died on the same day. And we wanted to know what was going on with this, and it turns out it's epigenetic. The decoration of methyl groups on the DNA is very variable. And my question is, are we going to have the technology for learning where these methyl groups are located and what they mean in the near future?
Doesn't that work out to, like, you tell people, okay, eat spinach for 3 weeks, and then 3 weeks later, if things get better, then you could say, well, someone ought to take a look at me and see whether spinach made the difference. I mean, it seems to me that that's a, well, I don't know what I'm talking about, but it seems to me.
I think methylation is another part of the technology that's being developed. People are already beginning to do whole genome methylation sequencing, and I think it'll be a natural extension of the technology that I think will add. You'll end up with a richer data set than we have today, but I think it's in the pipeline, and I think a few years from now, people who are doing the kinds of things that we're doing will also get methylation data, and I would expect we'll probably have our family sequenced again in the future when those technological advances come along and the data is even better.
But you'd have to be looking at it periodically because it's a dynamic process.
Sure.
To have it have information, right? I mean,
So I think our doctor should take up the advantage of saying, would you like to look at our genome, which he currently said he thought he wasn't interested in, because it's only going to get worse. So you better get expert now before
Yeah.
the methylation data arrives.
Here
It's
comes
gonna
the
be even
epigenome.
more challenging.
Right.
My doctor's like Jay's, and he said, I told him I'd had my genome sequenced. He said, why'd you do that? Do you want to look at it? No.
Carolyn, where was the next one?
Hi, Robert Green from Boston University and Harvard. I think that one useful way to think about this is the science of discovery, and then a separate science of disclosure. And we've been talking we've been going back and forth between those two sciences, almost assuming that one leads inevitably into the other. But there is a separate science that links them, and that's the science of, if you will, health outcomes. And it's a very important science to consider here that hasn't made its way into this discussion. And by analogy, think about the discovery of chemicals that you think will help people's health as pharmaceuticals. But the step you must take then is to actually do clinical trials with those chemicals and actually demonstrate that those chemicals. Now, the analogy here is that not all information is necessarily beneficial to human health. There is potential we talked about for anxiety. I'm not so worried about that. But there's also potential for what Amy McGuire has written about, that is raiding from the medical commons. In other words, utilizing so many resources with information that is probabilistic that you actually take energy and effort away from realistic medical problems. So I totally agree with, is it Mr. West, who said that we're going to need paradigms for prioritizing the utility of information, and we're going to need translational studies to demonstrate that they are in fact useful, because just thinking they're useful doesn't necessarily mean that they actually are useful.
Who has a microphone? How about right there? Yeah, this gentleman right there. Yeah.
So once on a second date, a woman asked me, so did your maternal grandfather go bald and when? And I know that you guys are going to say that we're going to avoid a Gattaca scenario because people are going to become educated and they won't ask dippy questions, but there are still astrologists out there, and we all do it through Google. Who would have thought that Google would have changed our culture? In the 1980s, I would never have hired a private investigator to track someone down, but I Google search people all the time. So how will culture change despite education if all this data is out there? What do you think?
Well, hopefully they will. There are plenty of people who don't do astrology as well. And I think the bigger danger is they will actually learn something about your tendency to get pattern baldness and worry about that for some reason or other. You know, I think that this is related to the issue of abandoned DNA. There was a rumor that some politicians, including Barack Obama, who had people sequestering all his coffee cups so that no one could do his DNA sequence during the election. But that's, of course, absurd because every one of you has deposited your DNA sequence in this room. We're not going to sequence it as far as I know. But that's going to be out there, and unless people care deeply about that, that could be, unfortunately, the killer app that you were looking for a little while ago. Yeah.
So we
Kirk
have a
is right next to you.
Yeah. Question here.
Yeah, go ahead,
Microphone?
Kirk.
Hi, my name is Natalie Garcia from Kennedy Academy, and I wanted to ask if you don't have your genome sequence 100% because you can't read it by the machine. What if you give a patient advice, a doctor gives the patient advice of how to take care of the disease that's written on their genome, and it causes another disease to appear? What will happen then? What if the doctor makes a mistake, well, doesn't make a mistake, but treats something that isn't as severe as the new disease?
I mean, they go after one and then that triggers another?
Yes.
Yeah.
It never happens now.
Esther says that that happens already.
Yeah.
Which you said in reverse.
It's what Bob Green was talking about. You need outcomes research to make sure that the drugs you take don't cause the benefits outweigh the risks. Almost everything has some kind of risk that there's going to be a bad medical outcome, and so you just need to constantly reevaluate, especially in combinations of drugs, combinations of genes with drugs, genes with other environmental components. And your point is absolutely on target with Bob's, that you need to have outcomes and tests where they're carefully controlling for these things as carefully as we can.
We have the person with the mic in the back.
Hi, my name is Matt Cowell. I'm curious, George, you mentioned there are about 1,800 clinically useful known genetic variations with tests that you can get, and I assume that many of those have at least one, probably a number of patents protecting the association or at least the isolation or the analysis of the variant. So if I win the exome sequence here today, or I shell out $40,000 to get my genome sequenced, am I breaking the law to make those associations? I imagine I am, and as genome sequencing becomes more prevalent, how do we deal with this patent thicket?
Is the law that you're worried about breaking that you would be using a patent in an unauthorized
Yeah, so
manner?
maybe it doesn't matter because I personally won't get sued. I don't even have to tell anyone. But if this stuff, especially if there's software that's automated, that's definitely looking at screens, it would be obvious that these associations were being made. So how do we deal with the IP problem? And I know there's a breakout session on this later, but what do you think,
Well,
guys?
so this is in the news because Myriad Genetics was sued by the American Civil Liberties Union. My personal opinion is that suit only covered a small fraction of the Myriad intellectual property, and so they could go out and sue another company that's going to make money. They won't sue an individual. In fact, they probably won't sue a lot of nonprofit organizations that are doing this. On the other side is that their technology that they're representing may be obsolete at this point. So they kind of won this battle that they apparently lost, but then they're going to lose a bigger battle, which is if you sequence your whole genome, you didn't really infringe the patent. If I sell you a machine that can do anything, can sequence anything, I'm not telling you to go out and infringe Myriad's patent. You've got, and if the interpretation software is, say, free, hypothetically, on the web, who are they going to sue for that? It's really going to be very difficult for them to do this. Alternatively, companies could get together that have a lot of these patents and stack them up, as they do in electronics, so that no one of them gets 5–10%. They each get the fraction that I think more likely that's just the entire industry is going to be completely reformatted, and it will not be an issue. But it could happen. It should happen. We should be able to stack up patents in almost any industry. There's not anything particularly exceptional about this one.
I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing if people have patents and want to charge for it. Frankly, it costs a lot of money to figure out these associations, and if some company has gone out and made the investment and figured those things out, and if I could get a medical benefit of that, I'd be willing to buy their service because it's giving me a useful service, and so why wouldn't I pay for that? I think the question is, if it's extortionate or whatever, that's one question. But if it's extortionate, they're not going to have many customers. So I think the sense is that as the testing is becoming inexpensive, then the analysis also has to probably be in a similar kind of price range, or they won't have any customers. The big opportunity is probably in high volume, relatively low price, comprehensive genetic analysis. I think that could be a great market, and I encourage companies to enter that, figure out those things, and I'd be ready to stand up and be one of the first customers.
Does anyone have the microphone? Okay, well, you get the last question.
Okay, well, I'm not sure this is entirely a question, maybe a little comment. One of the things that always occurs to me is how embryonic our ability to phenotype is. People immediately assume, well, it's biochemical phenotyping, so it's PKU, and you know what that is. But when you work with infertile couples and you work with women who want a donor, their idea of phenotype is something we're not used to providing them from a genetic standpoint, because I've heard things like no buggy eyes, no bushy brows. Okay, what is that? What gene?
Got the gene for that.
Yeah.
Haven't you found that?
You run into what I would call morphogenic genetic influences, and by morph I just mean body size, type, athleticism or not, and we don't even describe it well. We don't really know how to link a gene with a pointy head. Okay, so I think
cosmetic genomics.
Yeah, the general public they care about medicine and disease, but there's a group of them who are talking about phenotype in a very descriptive, I would say a very right-brained way. And I think medicine's not used to that because it's not lethal. It doesn't kill you if you are a little dysmorphic, but it also, it's difficult to describe beauty. And in the fertility area, women are after height, brains, and beauty. So if you are going to use genetic testing to help them, we have to get better at what I would call phenotypic description of the human body. And we're really way down at near zero on that. It's very difficult for us to even describe what we're talking about. I don't know if anyone has a comment on that.
I got a quick one. It turns out a lot of physical characteristics are highly heritable, meaning that you see a great concordance in identical twins relative to their fraternal twins. And also in other animals about where we do have morphological measurements that you can study the genetics of it. So if this is important, it will be studied. And there are medical consequences. So many syndromes are described in terms of the side consequences they might have on non-medical features, like Down syndrome has characteristic effects on the face, even though the medical consequences more have to do with the heart and the mind. So another aspect of this is in terms of jurisprudence. If you could actually get a facial sketch of someone from their DNA, that might or might not be something that society wants to be able to do.
This is the genotype of va-va-voom. Well, that's it. Lunchtime?
Yep. Thank you, everybody.